So I also just mentioned a little bit about field growing versus indoor growing. Indoor growing puts a little bit of an artificial situation. Yes, great security, no question about it, but it creates a problem, and insects really love it. Your air systems are connected with everybody else. You're getting drift outside, but you're also, nowadays, at least in Colorado, you get drift inside, because it's coming through an air system that is coming from another grow, maybe in the same strip mall or wherever you are located. These are small, but they're still grows that are supplying materials to stores, dispensaries. So you want to know if it's clean. It's very possible. I've been in plenty of grows that are not using pesticides, and I think all of us will mention some alternatives there. You can easily grow things without chemical residues. Certainly look at that. I've seen seaweed applications. I've seen lactobacillus bacterial amendments. I've seen, and that's not a clinical term, amendments meaning things that you put onto your plant. I have seen the use of aerosol of hydrogen peroxide being effectively used in grows on a prophylactic basis. So there's a lot of alternatives. Organic is not a federal term. We can say it, but we can't be organic certified. And certainly there's a lot of entities working on that. And that's another conversation that will come up during our talk. As I mentioned, there's 120 cannabinoids and certainly terpenes, and those have a really important effect. If you've read any of Ethan Russo's work on the entourage effect medically, it's not just THC that we're looking at. It's really a combination. And being an ethnobotanist, I look at traditional healers, and the way they use plants is in combination. They rarely use a single plant. They often have plants that are mixed into formulas that drive plants to do other things, that might make things more active, that might detoxify or make them more bioavailable, and put things on the skin to make them be absorbed better. So look at the whole plant if you're going towards growing or in research, please. So who is accountable for this? The testing is all over the place. We would like to make sure that everybody's accountable for this. If you're a grower, when are you testing? Certainly, you're tracking all your information on what you do and how you do it, hopefully. But there's a lot of contaminations that enter into this supply chain. And as we said, there's some typical things like pesticides, because as the flower matures, it gets really yummy and it gets sticky, and so the attraction is there. Certainly, if you increase your humidity and temperature, sometimes that creates a problem with bacteria loads, fungicide, things like that. Although sometimes increasing humidity has a good effect on some things as well. So really kind of learn these methodologies for someone who's tried them. And so these applications of herbicides, fungicides, and bactericides are a little bit out of control. Things are being used that are not legal, things that are being drenched, the plants are being drenched versus just lightly sprayed. So what we've had is a group of people who have been very creative as breeders and growers of some sort, but now being on this commercial scale, we've got them going to a much larger profile, and therefore there's a lot of people who don't have the experience of growing. I'm not saying there aren't a lot of talented people out there. There are quite a few. But there are a lot of people who don't know. And these are the questions you have to ask from anyone you're purchasing your materials from, or anyone you're working with. And that's the only way to find out, is to make sure you are doing this testing yourself in a verbal manner, but making sure that their documentation is in place. In the dietary supplement industry, we have specifications, which you have here as well, but we have certificates of analysis. And sometimes we call them certificates of, I forgot the term right now, but ambivalence, thank you. So it's still called a C of A, but it's called ambivalence. And so it's not worth much. People write things down, but they don't test. And so dry labbing in this case, where someone says they tested but really did nothing, and you get a lab report, does happen at times. So be very careful, talk to that person. Why are you using that? What criteria, what kind of equipment, what kind of training, all of this. And I know there's some labs in the audience that can speak towards this as well. I also wanted to mention heavy metals. Cannabis is a phytoremediator. In other words, it's a great plant. If there's toxicity in the ground, it will pull it up. But if you don't know that, you haven't done any land study and looked at the history of the water source of what you're planting, then you want to make sure that you've tested for heavy metals because it could accumulate lead, cadmium, mercury, and others. You don't want that in your system, okay? So make sure that's one of the tests you're looking at. And if you're using metals, then homogeneity, uniformity of the blend is going to be really important. Colorado's had a lot of people come in, like Marie Dowd in the New York Times, who goes in her hotel room, overeats, doesn't follow the label, and consumes way too much of an edible that on the label says, just try the 10 milligrams. Then wait half an hour. But no, some of them just don't wait, and they eat a lot, and then they're incapacitated to the point where they're kind of freaking out, and that's increased hospital visits. But I think it's more of the ignorance of the consumer. I think in California, where this is not as regulated, there's problems, and I know Alex and I talked about this, and we were visiting some other people, which someone took a small bite of a candy bar, and for 2 days they could not communicate, So make sure your vacation time's in place, because you're going to have to be sitting at home probably during that time. And you want to be able, of course, to test for constituents, and as I mentioned, it's a lot more than THC there. So ask those questions of the people you're working with, ask your bud tenders. So we often say trust then verify, but I don't think that's accurate anymore. I think we have to verify and then trust, and not to be able to assume that people say, oh yeah, it's really good. But that's not a scientific term. There's no data to kind of show me the data when I go into a bud tender and show me that it's been tested. So if I'm going to purchase something, or your patients are going to purchase something, you cannot be a good healer unless your patients actually can buy something that's going to benefit them. So make sure it does have that. Make sure that if they've been tested, that lab is using validated methods. Now, there are a lot of methods out there. USP, United States Pharmacopoeia. There's a great monograph put out by American Herbal Pharmacopoeia. It's a very inexpensive monograph, $44. You get it online. It shows you how to grow, test, just about everything. A lot of the states have adopted that. Colorado is not. I think Washington and Oregon have. I don't know where else. I'm working with Pistil and Stigma, and Katie's in the audience here. We have some really great booklets that allow you to, kind of like a how-to. And they'll be in some modules. I think the final format isn't there, but they'll be in different modules, so you can buy how to grow, or how to test, or how to create products with them as edibles or tinctures. So there's a lot of information. They've got a lot of data there. We work with them on a quality card, and they're in process, so please ask her for some contact information. American Herbal Products Association is also online. They work in the dietary supplement. They do have a cannabis committee, and they do have a lab committee, so they are establishing guidelines. They're free, they're online. You can easily get those to look at some of the guidelines they're doing. So find out if the tests that labs are doing, if they're not within these documents, are they fit for purpose? Are they asking the right quest? Have they been validated? Is someone developing them and not really testing them? I think a lot of it depends on the intended use, but I think also you want to make sure that the test it's not just the test. There are methods out there, as I said, but it's the validation of the equipment. It's a lot of things. There's contamination that occurs in all steps of it. So even though you might have concentrates, I think that's next slide. There's one slide I forgot to put in, but in the concentrates, there's a lot of problems. And I'm not going to talk about that because a lot of our panelists can speak to that a lot more. But what I'm saying is that in the concentration of materials and when you're using your extraction, there's all sorts of issues. Not only do you have your solvents and your concentration of your pesticides, but you also have lubricants, in your equipment. There's lots of things can go wrong. So look at your system and see what you should test and how to test it, and still again question these. If they don't have a method, ask them where they're getting a method. If not, help them find those. Colorado right now, I think we have a huge problem with pesticides. Now that the governor has said that there's a zero tolerance, which is not really scientific, but it will be a detection limit. We just want to get people using things that are at least approved for plants. Now, you can't use pesticides and work with EPA in a sense because that's a federally regulated organization. Well, that's a federal organization, therefore it's federally regulated. And so they can't work with us to decide which pesticides, who tests what. And really, there's a zero tolerance of any pesticide if it hasn't been tested on that specific plant. So in the dietary supplement industry, we're really not supposed to be using anything because they haven't been tested unless you're using strawberries or something. So be aware of that regulation, and it can only be a detection method then. We encourage, organic for whatever that might mean, and I think a lot of people are working on that. And you want to just get people using safe items, and those things that are at least listed, the 50 or so in Colorado that will be allowed to test for, make sure that they're using those, who are using it at the proper level. But, and this is something we'll talk about, there's a lot of other things that have been used out there that are residual, that remain in the air, in the soil, in the water. So there's a lot of things, it's kind of confusing because there's so many things you can test for. And so, I've listed some of the problems and the risk points, and I'm hoping then that you'll be thinking of these and asking questions, and then I'll pass on the mic to Dr. Oh, sorry, you don't need to.
I've decided I'm just going to show you one slide to try to help you understand. If I could hit that first slide, please. If you don't mind, I'm just going to stand here so I can see this better. If I could get that next slide, please. There we go. That's what I want to show you. I want you to understand how incredibly sensitive we all are in the way of our response to chemicals. The natural concentration of hormones in a woman's body, for example, for estrogen, are 40 to 400 parts per trillion. That's the range in which we function. This is below the typical limit of detection of any of our technology today, unless you have a very, very good mass spectrometer and some really good pre-processing. And what I want to illustrate over here for a healthy system is we had lunch and we took in mass and energy and nutrients, and that's what fuels our molecular and cellular systems. And those molecular and cellular systems make up three key relationships of organ systems: the central nervous system, the endocrine or the hormonal systems, and the immune system. These two basic pyramids, if you will, support individual levels of reproduction, growth, and behavior. And they support population-level functions of birth rates, death rates, and social structure, which support community-level things like immigration, and relative species abundance. Now, I'm not sure how I advance this thing. Do I push the button?
Push the button to the right.
The arrow?
Yeah, arrow to the right.
Arrow to the right, okay. There we go. I want to point out to you that these, one of the things we have discovered in the research that we've done with mixtures of pesticides is that often you will see that the lower that you go in the dose, the greater the effect. Like, for example, in the immune system, we've shown, for example, if you start at a level the EPA says is totally safe for Ubiquitous at 1,000 parts per billion, we get a suppression of immune function. But if you go all the way down to 1 part per billion, you get a tripling of that immune suppression. And that's because you're starting to get into that physiological dose range that I was telling you about. And I also want to point out that the gut here is full of microbes, and if you start messing with microbes, which most pesticides do, especially things like Roundup, glyphosate, which shut down an amino acid synthesis pathway, you wind up losing many of the beneficial bacteria in the gut and wind up suppressing immune function. And then I want to point out that there's something else really important that many people don't think about, and that's gene expression. On healthy systems, you've got pulsating information from the genetic system that controls this molecular and cellular system. But what we've been finding with pesticides and their suppression of these things is that the environmental contaminants have learned how to hack the code of genes. They've learned how to flip off the switches that turn on genes. And so what you get is developmental patterns that get changed. You get changes in sexual behavior. You get changes in the neurological formation of the brain in fetuses. You get changes in whether or not you make testes or ovaries, or maybe you might have both. There are whole suites of things that involve all three of these systems. And I want to tell you that each of all these three systems collectively have about 60 different languages that they speak to each other with, 60 different kinds of molecules, and they're all down in the parts per trillion range, which typically is below what you can measure analytically. And so getting the chemicals and pesticides and heavy metals that Trish mentioned out of these systems and making sure that they run healthy is a really serious problem. And I'm just going to stop right there.
I just want I think it would be useful to just address a few questions to panelists, particularly to Richard and Alex, who can discuss some of these points in more detail and how that would relate to for example, especially some of the things that Dr. Porter just raised, are extremely interesting. And so first, Richard, I just wondered, for example, the number of, in your state, registered gardeners and growers is tending to climb almost exponentially. And how does that actually change the kinds of pesticides that cannabis growers are growing? I mean, we hear a lot in the industry about things like but from your perspective, as someone who actually works in this industry, how has that changed? And then
So, easiest way to answer this question is just probably a quick history, a brief history of just the last 15 years of the industry. 15 years ago, and I'm primarily going to be speaking about the West Coast growing operations. That's where the majority of the cannabis is produced in this country. So we'll focus on that. Obviously, the numbers of gardens 15 years ago were considerably smaller than what we see today. And ergo, the numbers of problems that the growers faced were also smaller in number. Typically, as far as pests were concerned, or insects, you had two-spotted spider mites, thrips, fungus gnats, occasional topical aphid, and most of these pests were handled and treated with very benign products: neem, azadirachtin, insecticidal soaps, horticultural oils. In the most severe cases, you may see an application of avid or fluoramide, which is a low dose bifenthonate. But those were only the most extreme cases, and it wasn't really until right around 2009, after the mass explosion of medical gardens around California, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington, that we started to see new pests that we had never faced before. The first one was the root aphid. The root aphid threw just about every single gardener who faced it the first time completely off. They had no idea even that they had a pest to begin with, due to the effects that that pest has on the plants. So most growers went to very harsh systemics to help stave off the root aphid problem, and primarily Merit 7, which is an imidacloprid product, a fairly high dose of one. Now, the inherent problem with something like Merit 70 is that it takes about 240 days to degrade from a plant, and that is twice the average time of a normal growing cycle for cannabis. So that was the first kind of alarm that I noticed that we have a problem here. A couple years later, around 2013, we started to see the Europhyllid mites, so broad mite, russet mite, cyclamid mite, and And these might spread around the West Coast like wildfire. In a matter of about 6 months, we went from ground zero in Northern California to Arizona, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington. And it had to do a lot with once again, another explosion of gardens, and then the kind of the clone trading game between states. These mites were not affected by the typical azadirachtin-based products, nor was pyrethrin very effective on them. Something like the broad mite, which exudes a toxin that the plant absorbs. You get rid of the mite, and the toxin still runs right through the plant. We have to learn how to combat that as well. Once again, a new list of systemic pesticides became the customer's product of choice. Spiromethricins, shuttle forbid, acromite, which was a heavy dose of bifenthrin, fluoramide's 14%, acromite is 50%, substantially high. So those challenges were unfortunately answered by primarily message boards online. So a grower thought he had, or she had, let's say a russet mite, and they go to the message board, well, what are people using? Well, I use a combination of avid, shuttle, and forbid in 3-day rotations. That's bad. That's not only bad for the applicator, it's certainly bad for the end user. And it's an inherent harm and risk. As a consultant to the industry and as someone who sells products across the country to customers, one of my missions was to try to find alternatives to try to circumvent some of these long-lived systemic products. And we'll get to that for a future conversation here. But the other thing that became interesting is we started to learn about different adulterants that were also entering the supply chain. Most of those were PGRs. Most prominently is paclobutrazol. It is found in a slew of products that are designed for ornamental plant growth. It arrests the development, the elongation of shoots during the flowering process, and allows for more flower sites to develop. Dimethylzine was another compound that was found in many products. A lot of unscrupulous companies market towards the hydroponic industry. They've been doing this for years. They sell products that would normally most definitely be designed just for ornamentals to cannabis growers, making generally very accurate claims of what the product does, but without educating the end user the risks of that product. Another adulterant that we saw entering the chain, and this came through laboratory testing, believe it or not, was hyponyl butoxide, which is an extender for things like pyrethrin, which would normally be fairly safe. A lot of growers use pyrethrin foggers, both proactively and reactively for mites. And one thing that we were not aware of is that this PBO compound is very slow to break down and would actually lodge up in air exchange systems and HVAC systems and build up over time and then start to dump out over the garden even months, 3-4 months down the road after it's been applied. It's due to the fact that there's no light in air systems. And light is one of the things that breaks down that compound. So the numbers of risks are inherently due to, unfortunately, an uneducated customer base that doesn't understand that the product that they use, even though it works well and it solves the problem, how long it stays in the plant and what that inherent health risk is to an end user who may be combusting the product. We hear a lot of people talk about microbutyl, Eagle 20. We hear it all over the food industry. But it's not just microbutyl that presents a problem. It's the entire triazole family. That when it goes to pyrolysis, you get your hydrogen side. Not good for people who are vaporizing, smoking, or eating edibles.
Alex has a long history in natural products doing CO2 extraction before there was anything in CO2 extraction. She was natural products. And a lot of expertise in that area. And so I'd like if Alex could talk a little about that and some of the things that concern us, since we're very interested in extraction processes and ways of doing that safely and remediating them are the issues of potential concentration and the concentrates of things other than what you want to concentrate. Then the issue of, just alluded to by Richard, unregistered and unsafe pesticides, which can be present perhaps, even in the hydroponic solutions without being on the label. Pesticides that are, since there's no EPA oversight, since the EPA doesn't recognize cannabis as existing. So maybe Alex could address some of these, what to many of us in these industries are extremely important issues.
Yeah, thank you, Randy. So just to follow up on what Rich said, as if it didn't sound scary enough. First, we know it's endemic. There's been some published research recently, some literature, that these chemicals are used ubiquitously. It's blanket use, even by people that are claiming to have natural and organic products. You see it in those products, and I think they get contaminated by some of the mechanisms that Rich identified and that Trish mentioned. They come from the clones, they're in the HVAC systems, it's drift from outdoor spraying, and when they're going indoors, we go down the list. So the best of intentions, people end up with a contaminated temptation commodity, as they call it downstairs. So the risk is serious, and not just for the reasons that Dr. Porter mentioned, which is that these things can be active at extremely low levels in the body, and they almost have this weird homeopathic type of dose-response curve, because the body is looking for a lot of these hormonal mimics in extremely small levels. What happens when products are extracted, whether they're made for edibles or for vape pens or for other delivery systems, is that the chemicals are often the same type of chemical, or the same molecular weight, same polarity as the cannabinoids. So when people are concentrating it down, whether they're using CO2, which we're familiar with, or they're using hydrocarbons, butane, propane, whatever, or even with ethanol, as they go through the process of trying to increase the level of actives in the finished product, which makes the medical or the vape pen or the topical or the suppository all that much more potent. They've also increased the concentration of the pesticide levels. So about 7 years ago now, I think, a lab on the West Coast was testing a lot of the concentrates that were coming from the major CO2 oil manufacturers in California. And the flower trend, essentially, was clearing. It wasn't detecting at the threshold the levels that you look for these pesticides. It was below those thresholds of detection, where they were safe within sort of the EPA's model as residual on the plant, on the commodity. Ignoring the fact that the EPA is mostly looking at the exception of tobacco that things you eat, like blueberries and strawberries, you don't smoke those. And the tobacco industry is not the most forthcoming about what happens when you smoke pesticides. And as Rich points out, one that's used prolifically, equal 20-microbutanol, converts to cyanide and you heat it up. So ignore that. The plants were coming in as the trim and the flower was coming in as essentially safe by very good analytical methodology. Unfortunately, when they tested the concentrates that was made from this clean plant material, it was off the charts. It would be 10x to 100x over any reasonable agreed level of safety. And it was actually confusing. The test had to be sent outside for additional validation. Everyone was confused. And then someone just simply looked at the molecular extraction and said, no, this is obvious. This is totally predictable. So you have two principal problems as I see it. And one of them is a policy problem. And the policy problem is that you do not have a federal regulatory infrastructure like the EPA that covers responsible use of pesticides. You don't have an organic certification under the guidance of USDA that you use the word organic, it's supposed to mean something, and there's third-party audits to make sure it means something. In this industry, it's essentially a patchwork of state regulations. It's a mess industry. And even in the state regulations, there doesn't seem to be much agreement about what minimum residue levels, as the EPA would call them, are safe for a commodity, even a commodity that you eat, let alone one that you would smoke. So you don't have the regulatory infrastructure. There's no real repercussions. And the answer of the governor of Oregon, or the governor of Washington, whatever that says, zero tolerance, Colorado, that doesn't solve the problem because there's no such thing as a zero level of pesticides. It's like they joke about a $20 bill is contaminated with cocaine anywhere in the world. So if you test for these very low levels, you will find pesticides. And then you put the growers in really this difficult position, which is if they test, they now know their stuff is contaminated. If it's contaminated, they have to destroy the crop, and the crop is their livelihood. And people will fight for their livelihood. So I think you have a policy issue that fundamentally needs to be talked about, and that's why this panel is so important, and that's why VOTEC was foresightful to have this panel. And then the second thing you have is sort of a technology problem. You need to have the analytical methods and the trained labs, and these analytical methods require extremely expensive equipment that most labs simply do not have in this industry, and qualified people to run those labs and operate that equipment, which is not an easy resource to get. Highly competitive for people that can run expensive mass spec machines, for example. Machines cost $1 million each. So you've got to now get the analytical methods up to speed, and the testing methods, so that the policy implementation can be actually applied to the ground. And then on top of that, we now have people producing concentrates, and we've all seen the growth, the hockey stick growth of extracts over flowers. And if you end up with orders of magnitude increased level of the pesticides and the other toxins in the concentrates, and then people are smoking these, this further makes it complicated. You have to get back to this really interesting question. Like we could debate, as this conference has done, whether cannabis is helpful or harmful, particularly for developing brains, and on this downstairs. But if you're smoking a neurotoxin at doses that are off the charts, the example I use is if it occurred in a Walmart in the conventional produce section, they shut the entire Walmart down. There'd be yellow newspaper outside the Walmart. So you've got people smoking products, and oftentimes adolescents smoking products, that they're known neurotoxins. And that's one of the mechanisms by which they work. And we know that they affect DNA. Dr. Porter studied this for decades. It's published in the literature. So it's almost like you need something in addition to the policy and the analytical infrastructure that can give a grower or an extractor an alternative to trying to comply with a system that doesn't exist, or if the system does exist and they comply with it, they go out of business. And that's one of the things that we think is so critical. That growers could figure out a way, or processors, extractors could figure out a way to remediate some of these toxins, at least to levels that would be somewhat acceptable, let's say, in organic produce extraction, ideally in combustible product like tobacco. That would be a big step forward. And that would be a topic for discussion and conversation.
Not as much as this is all passing to me or not this at all. So there's a lot of new information here in the concept. I think one of the things that you're emphasizing is that if anything, our regulations are to reduce our exposure to homeopathic levels. It's a paradoxical thing where to be safe, we want to be exposed to as few of these neurotoxins and actually alternative substances. But then it's the lower levels that our body is responding to them as if they're part of our immune system.
This is why we need to rethink exactly how we're using this stuff in the first place. Because if you're using pesticides, if you're using pesticides, there's no way you're going to not be impacting biological systems in adverse ways. And so the industry, the organic food industry, and people who do that kind of thing, there are people out there, in fact, I just heard a couple of days ago when we were at the beyond pesticides, maybe a name that there's a fellow out in North Dakota who's running 5,000 acres of land. He's got 12 different crops. He uses no pesticides, no herbicides, no artificial fertilizers. Everything is done organically. These kinds of technologies could be used to produce cannabis, and a lot of considered exclusive possibilities of stuff coming in the air from people who are using it would be mitigated substantially. And ultimately, that's what we're going to have to go. It's market will just drive it. If you're looking for healthy stuff, because the last thing you want is somebody who's sick or using medicinal the effects of cannabis to be smoking it and suppressing their own immune systems, changing their hormones and altering their neurological functions, which control hormones.
I just wanted to emphasize something we were talking about before, Dr. Porter, maybe you could talk about this, but it's not only the actives in some of these compounds that you're spraying, but the inactive parts that are sometimes more dangerous. So be aware that it's not just what's on the label. There's a listing that says other inert, I think is what the word is. It's not true. They're not really inert.
They now call them other.
Is a question of the matter?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry. It was with the wide range of pesticides and the technical difficulty of testing for them. What would you do if it was your ideal world to set up what the tests and regulations would look like?
Dr. Porter, you probably are a good
In
person.
the ideal world, you just don't use them. You don't need them. It's cheaper, it's safer, and less expensive. The people who are using these kinds of technologies, like I was just telling you about that fellow in North Dakota who's running 5,000 acres, he's making more money because it's organic material, and he's spending 1/3 the cost just to do the planting and other things there. So, but it's going to take some out-of-the-box thinking because he uses tremendous diversity of his seedings and his ground covers, and by creating a very diverse environment, he creates a soil that supports this, because plants and the microbes and things in the soil are talking to each other all the time. They trade nutrients, and there's a huge commerce that goes on beneath the surface of the soil, and that's what keeps his plants and his animals healthy.
Thank you. I'd like to just a quick add to that as far as what we're doing actually with cannabis in Oregon. So we do preach good practice, and it does center around biopesticide, biofungicide practices, primarily building up a healthy living soil that has an incredible amount of biodiversity. In addition, using biopesticides that are fungally based, which are generally benign to end users, to create these prophylactics around the tissue of the plant, around the root systems of the plant that make it harder for fungal pathogens to infect, and make it harder for these insects to persist on the exterior and the soil of these plants. So steps are being taken now to help push this agenda further, and we hope that it doesn't just stop Oregon and California. We want it to happen across the country, but it takes education to get there.
And it's also important to mention that insects that attack plants are attacking plants that are sick in the first place. Healthy plants typically are not attacked. And when a plant is sick, it actually emits pheromones that bring in insect pests.
Lauren?
Do we know what's happening at the
Can you
university?
speak up a little
Do we
louder?
do we know what's happening at our one grow center at the University of Mississippi? What practices are used there?
Have you ever seen a picture of that?
I have.
Everybody can hear what's everybody's talking about.
asking about the diet.
I heard the question.
It's a fair question.
So we don't know.
Fair question.
Is that the answer? We don't know. I have seen the picture that Sue Cicely shows of the sticks.
So does everyone know what she's talking about?
Yes.
Okay.
No information has come out of that program.
So Trish, you've been familiar with the facility for
I don't know, but I'm about to ask him now because I never really did. This is Dr. Slowly at the University of Mississippi that has this facility.
I think
And he, when I spoke to him last week, I was in Mississippi, he's asking for people. He wants the diversity that he doesn't have. He's asking, but the limitations of You have to be a DEA certified. Only DEA people can share things. So if you have anybody who's a DEA or you're confiscating material as a DEA, I guess you can share it. So anyway, he is seeking variety to be able to provide that for testing.
Well, that's actually a really, really good question. And what it indicates is what Dr. Porter is alluding to and what Rich's experience is with sort of an integrated pest management approach. And that is that if you have more genetic diversity, not less, so we'll use the word strain, when we go for these highly, brilliantly cultivated cultivars, these very strain-specific monocrops, you actually decrease the ability of the plant's natural defense mechanisms to resist a pathogen. And this industry, above many other industries, with maybe the exception of some of the ornamental industries, has created more monocrops than you can imagine. These are very, very specific cultivar strains. And they become really susceptible, and that's when you get this wildfire spreading, this endemic spreading, whether it's by sharing of clones, the clone, cross-state clone railway, whatever they call it, or whether it's coming through other means, the plants don't have the natural ability to fight it off. And then to answer your question about in an ideal world, well, in an ideal world, you have a seed to shelf, I guess you'd call it responsible practices, model, good horticultural practices, good processing practices, good pest management practices, genetic diversity. You probably have less indoor growing, quite frankly. And that would tend to keep the whole system a little bit more sustainable. But we are, I would guess, given how long it took the nutritional industry, the dietary supplement, and the organic food industry to reach its level of better, but certainly not good enough, end-to-end good practice, I would guess we're 10 years off in the cannabis industry. It took the natural products industry, what, 25 years?
Took them too long. But what I think about this is that the trajectory within the cannabis industry is going to be sharper and faster. The dietary supplement industry took a long time. We have lots of different species of plants. Just think of it, 2,000. We have a lot. So, to figure out matrices and things like that for testing and what is appropriate for each species, because sometimes it's species specific. So I think the trajectory here is shorter. Actually, I'd like to say shorter than 10 years.
Before I go to the questions, I just wanted to make one trivial point. It's actually not trivial. Just mycobutanol, when it's pyrolyzed, actually probably does form some small amounts of cyanide. But actually, small amounts of cyanide you form every day in your body and metabolize. Cyanide is actually not very toxic. I'd be a lot more worried about some of the other pyrolysis products, the azoles, which we have no idea what they are, which could be carcinogenic. They're probably heterocycles, they're probably carcinogenic, they're probably nitrosamides.
Did you talk about some of them?
And cigarettes, by the way, have quite, some cigarettes have quite high levels of nicotine, has quite high levels of hydrogen cyanide in this one, actually.
So my question then to Randy, because he really get to talk, is, we make these concentrates, and as Alex said, we concentrate down some of the contamination and make it just better access. He's got a system that can remove those materials easily and differentiate between the cannabinoids, so it's quite successful in that. But what I'm wondering is that then we put it in glycerin or some other form in the vape pens, and I wonder if you could speak towards the biology of that.
Yeah, I mean, basically, we don't know a lot about a lot of the things that we're putting in things like vape pens. And it's certainly true that things like glycerol, if they get hot enough, can then pyrolyze to form acrolein, which is a known carcinogen, teratogen, regulated by EPA and so forth. Probably propylene glycol or some conditions could do that if it gets heated hot. Glycerol is well known to do that. So there are a lot of concerns about all the other things which are not documented. They're just, additives of basically unknown that are put into these things and then heated up. And Yes, I should add to the other point that Tricia made. You know, we are developing systems to clean up things that are contaminated. But the whole point of what I think we're trying to talk about here is, in fact, to not have to clean them up, but rather to make sure that people are using best practices rather than worst practices. So that we really don't need to clean up. And the only condition you really need to clean up is, you know, if somebody's growing outside and the farmer next door sprays corn or something and drifts over to your patch, and you have some low levels that you don't want that can be concentrated. So I think I want to make clear that the idea of a cleanup process is not to take crude, you know, heavily contaminated material that's, you know, white all over the surface with eagle 20, and then extract that and have the eagle 20 crystallizing out, and, you know, expect that you're going to clean that out.
So then that lets a lower diversification for our labs, because if all the labs are just testing pesticides, that creates a lot of competition and using the same method. This way we'd be testing for some of the nasty things that you're finding in vape pens and making sure, you know, that that's what we're looking for, not just only the agricultural problems that we have. There are a lot of other things that maybe we can diversify in our laboratory testing and encourage people to do that.
Yeah, can we take some